Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We always say the best ideas for these deep dives come from you, and that's exactly what we're doing today.
Absolutely. It's so many requests to dig deeper into habit formation.
It's something we all struggle with, right? Like, how do we actually make those positive changes stick?
And stick around because we're not just going to be talking about willpower and motivation, those kind of surface level
Oh
tips.
no, we're going way deeper.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at the actual science behind how habits form the neurological processes, all that good stuff.
Okay, so like brain science, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really cool is that when we understand the science, we can actually use that knowledge to, kind of hack our brains a little bit.
Hack our brains, all right? I'm intrigued already. So, where do we start with all this?
Well, one of the sources you sent used this really interesting analogy comparing our brains to computers.
Okay, I'm listening.
Like, you know how a computer has all these programs running in the background?
Yeah.
Habits are kind of like those programs, or like automated processes that free up our mental energy for other stuff.
So, like, my brain is running the breathe program automatically so I can focus on what to say right now?
Exactly. And the more we run those programs, the more ingrained they become, which is why breaking bad habits is so tough. You're essentially trying to rewrite deeply ingrained code.
So, it's like trying to uninstall a program that's been running for years.
Pretty much. And there's actually some really cool research on the neurological pathways involved. You know, how those pathways get stronger the more we use them.
That makes sense. But before we dive too deep into the neurology stuff, didn't we want to talk about the habit loop?
Oh, yeah, good point. That's kind of the foundation of all this. The habit loop is this three-part cycle that every habit follows.
So remind me, what are those three parts again?
Cue, routine, and reward.
Okay, so like let's say I'm trying to make running a habit. The cue could be seeing my running shoe by the door. The routine is the actual run. And the reward is that feeling of accomplishment afterward.
Perfect example. And what's really important is that all three elements of the loop need to be strong for the habit to form.
So like if my running shoes are buried in the closet, I'm less likely to go for a run.
Exactly. The cue needs to be obvious and readily accessible.
That makes sense. What about the routine itself? Like what if I just hate running?
Well, if the routine is too difficult or unpleasant, it's probably not going to stick no matter how strong the cue or reward is.
So maybe instead of trying to force myself to be a runner, I should pick an activity I actually enjoy, like dancing or swimming.
Exactly. Find something that feels good that you look forward to doing.
Okay, so we've got the cue and the routine. What about the reward? What if the reward just isn't doing it for me?
That's another common stumbling block. The reward needs to be something that's genuinely motivating for you. There's actually some interesting research on this concept of reward substitution, where you can kind of rewire your brain to find pleasure in things that weren't initially rewarding.
Wait, before we go down that rabbit hole, maybe we should lay out all the steps to building a habit successful. Didn't you say there were like 5 key steps?
You're right, let's do that. The first step, and this one is crucial, is to start small.
So don't try to run a marathon on day one.
Exactly. The key is to make the initial routine so easy that it's almost impossible not to do it. One of the sources had this great anecdote about a man who wanted to build a meditation habit.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember reading that. He started by meditating for just 2 minutes each day.
Exactly. And that's the whole point. By starting small, he eliminated all that resistance, all that friction.
So it's about building momentum, making the routine a little more challenging over time.
That's the second step, progressively increasing the difficulty. But there's a catch. It's not quite that
I
simple.
was going to say there's always a catch, right?
Well, it's not so much a catch as it is an important nuance. We don't want to increase the difficulty too quickly. It needs to be a gradual process so we don't get overwhelmed.
Gotcha. So small steps, gradual progress.
Exactly. And speaking of making things easier, the third step is all about using triggers.
Oh, yeah, like we were talking about earlier with the running shoes.
Right. And the sources you sent had some really creative examples of triggers beyond just leaving things out in the open, like using technology to set reminders or even tying a new habit to an existing one.
Okay, let's save those examples for later. What about step number 4?
Tracking your progress. Now, this might seem obvious, but there's actually a lot of psychology behind why this works. It turns out that,
Our brains love seeing those little wins add up. It's like a visual reward system, right?
bingo. And that brings us to the final step, celebrating those small wins.
Now, that's something I can definitely get behind. So we're talking about rewarding ourselves every time we hit a milestone.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be anything big. Even just acknowledging your effort can make a difference. One of the sources had this really interesting study on the power of positive self-talk.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear about that study, but I think we're running out of time for this part of the deep dive.
You're right. Let's pick up with that next time.
So make sure you come back for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into these 5 steps and unpack some more of those fascinating research studies.
It's going to be good. See you then.
Hey then. All right, so we're back and ready to keep going with this habit stuff.
Yeah, last time we left off talking about those 5 steps to building successful habits.
Right, starting small, increasing the difficulty, using triggers, tracking progress, and celebrating those small wins.
Exactly. And yeah, it all sounds pretty straightforward when you lay it out like that.
Yeah, totally. But I have a feeling there's more to it than that.
You're absolutely right. One of the sources you sent actually talked about how most habit-building advice is way too simplistic.
In what way?
Well, it often ignores the reality that, life happens.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Like motivation fades, we get busy, unexpected things come up, and sometimes we just don't feel like it.
So true. So how do we deal with those inevitable slumps? Is there some secret to staying motivated all the time?
Honestly, if there is, I haven't found it. But what the research suggests is that instead of relying solely on motivation, we should focus on building systems.
Systems. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so think of a system as like a framework that makes it easier to stick to your habits even when you're not feeling super motivated.
So it's like setting ourselves up for success.
Exactly. And one of the key elements of a system is those triggers we were talking about earlier.
Right. Putting your running shoes by the door so you're more likely to go for a run.
Exactly. But systems go beyond just environmental cues. They can also involve things like planning ahead, making decisions in advance so you don't have to think about them in the moment.
Oh, interesting. So like if I know I tend to overeat at night, I could plan out my dinner in advance and make sure I have healthy snacks on hand.
Exactly. You're essentially removing the decision fatigue.
I like that. Removing decision fatigue. And this whole systems thing reminds me of something you said earlier about most habit advice being too simplistic.
Oh, yeah? What was that?
You were saying how a lot of advice focuses on willpower and discipline. Like if you're not sticking to your habit, it's because you're not trying hard enough.
Right. And the problem with that approach is that it ignores the role of our environment.
Our environment.
Yeah, one of the sources actually used the term choice architecture to describe how our surroundings can either support or sabotage our habits.
Oh, wow. So it's like if you're trying to quit smoking, but you're constantly surrounded by people who smoke, it's going to be way harder.
Exactly. Or if you're trying to eat healthier, but your pantry is full of junk food.
Okay, so our environment matters a lot. But can we go back to the systems thing for a second? I'm still not quite clear on what that looks like in practice.
Sure, no problem. So let's say you want to build a system for a morning workout routine. One of the sources recommended laying out your workout clothes the night before.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one before.
But they also talked about prepping your breakfast and pre-filling your water bottle the night before and even setting out your headphones and workout playlist.
So it's about removing all those tiny little obstacles that could derail you in the morning.
Exactly. You're basically automating the decision-making process so when you wake up, everything is ready to go.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like setting your future self up for success.
Exactly. And that's a key principle of building effective systems. You're not just relying on your present self's motivation, but you're creating an environment that supports your desired behavior.
So triggers are part of the system, but it also involves planning ahead and making things as easy as possible.
You got it. But there's another crucial aspect of systems that we haven't talked about yet.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
It's the idea of building in accountability.
Oh, like having a workout buddy or joining a fitness class.
Exactly. Those are great examples. The sources actually talked a lot about the power of social support and how it can dramatically increase our chances of sticking to a new habit.
So it's like having someone to cheer you on and hold you accountable.
Pretty much, but accountability can also take other forms, like using a tracking app or even just telling a friend about your goals.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got systems, accountability, and all those 5 steps. But I'm curious, do these sources mention anything about dealing with setbacks?
Oh, absolutely, because let's face it, we're not going to be perfect all the time.
Right, like what happens when we slip up? Do we just give up and throw in the towel?
Definitely not. One of the sources actually had a whole section on reframing setbacks and viewing them as learning opportunities.
Instead of beating ourselves up about it.
Exactly. They emphasize the importance of self-compassion and understanding that slip-ups are a natural part of the process.
So it's more about getting back on track than striving for perfection.
Exactly. And speaking of getting back on track, they had some really interesting strategies for dealing with specific types of setbacks, like if you miss a workout or if you overeat.
I'd love to hear about those strategies, but I think we're going to have to save that for the next part of our deep dive.
You're right, we're running out of time again.
But don't worry, we'll be back with part 3 where we'll wrap up this whole habit conversation and leave you with some actionable takeaways.
Sounds good. See you then.
See you then. All right, so back for the final part of our habit deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much already.
It really is, from the science of the habit loop to the importance of systems and accountability, even how to handle those inevitable setbacks.
And yet, it feels like there's still more to uncover.
There is actually, one of the sources had this whole section on the connection between habits and our values.
Oh, values like our core beliefs and principles.
Exactly. The idea is that our habits aren't just isolated actions, they actually reflect what we truly care about.
I've never really thought about it that way before.
Like, think about someone who consistently makes time for exercise. It probably suggests they value their health and well-being.
Or someone who always prioritizes spending time with loved ones, that probably means they value relationship.
Precisely. And one of the studies in the source material found that people were way more likely to stick to habits that align with their core values.
That makes sense. If you're trying to force yourself to do something that doesn't feel meaningful, it's going to be a lot harder.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work.
So if I'm struggling to build a habit, maybe it's because it's not truly important to me.
That's definitely a possibility worth exploring. The source suggested asking yourself, why is this habit important to me? What values does it support?
And if you can't find a connection, maybe it's time to ditch that habit.
That's one option. But sometimes there are habits we know we should be doing, even if they don't feel super aligned with our values right now.
Like flossing.
Exactly. In those cases, the source recommended trying to reframe the habit in a way that connects it to something you do value.
So instead of viewing flossing as a chore, I could reframe it as a way to protect my teeth, which ultimately supports my overall health and well-being, which I do care about.
Exactly. It's all about finding the personal meaning that resonates with you.
I love that. So to sum it all up, we've talked about the habit loop, the 5 steps for success, the power of systems and accountability, the importance of self-compassion, and now this idea of aligning our habits with our values.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. So for our listeners who are ready to start building those life-changing habits, where do we even begin?
I'd say start by reflecting on your values, what's truly important to you. Then think about some small habits that could support those values.
And remember those 5 steps we talked about: start small, use triggers, track your progress, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And don't forget to celebrate those wins, no matter how small they seem.
Because every little step counts, right?
Absolutely. And remember, building habits is a journey, not a destination. So be patient with yourself and enjoy the process.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Hmm.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive on habit formation. As always, thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you.
And remember, you have the power to create the life you want, one small habit at a time.